during this whole time, he's been visited on a regular basis by that same man in the violet jacket, but always in a dream, except one night he wakes up and the man in the violet jacket is standing at the end of his bed. And she takes the mirror from him, but as she's taking the mirror, he kind of holds it and he says, "To all mortals, the future is changeable. But whoever gazes upon this mirror and sees his future revealed can no longer escape it. Does your majesty care to look?" Today we're going to be following up from the last episode about Ewell Stanley Andersen, the man who wrote 3 Magic Words, which was a popular self-help book in the 50s. But he went on to undergo this huge spiritual journey and adventure. And this adventure totally changed his life, which was already unique to begin with. But we cut it off last week when he remembered the night that he decided to take his own life. And that's where we're going to start up. Don't worry, I mean, obviously he didn't take his life, so good thing. But without further ado, let's get back into the episode. Thanks for tuning in. He'd actually been following this dream for about 7 years, and he felt like nothing was moving forward, and he was depressed about it. He was so disillusioned that he finally just decided, I'm going to end it all. And so he bought himself a bottle of liquor, and he got a rope, and he set up the rope so that he could hang himself with it. And he proceeded to get blitzed. And next thing he knows, it's 12 hours later, and there's a rope that's around his neck, and it's kind of dug into his skin. But the other end of the rope has broken free. And so he realizes that he apparently had hanged himself, and then the rope broke. And then he spent the rest of the night just kind of wallowing on the floor because he has all these rug burns on his face. And he he remembers being very calm about the whole thing, and he very calmly just goes to bed. He realizes, all right, maybe I'm not going to kill myself after all. And he goes to sleep. But when he's remembering all of this with the galvanometer, it is just sending the meter through the charts. There's a lot of resistance around this memory. So he goes back through the memory again. He tries to remember what happened while he was unconscious. And this time he actually remembers basically standing before a council, a group of people. And the people were explaining to him what he needed to do to basically avoid getting into this horrible state again, so that he would never experience that low again. So after he's done doing all of this galvanic resistance training, he starts to share it with his friends, and it becomes a real movement. More and more people are trying it. And they're noticing also that they're able to increase their theta waves, so increased creativity and, that's it, increased creativity. And his world really starts to change. He starts dressing differently. He views other people differently. He actually goes to hang out with a friend. He's been doing a lot of this alpha training, and he goes to hang out with a friend who wants to introduce him to hypnosis. They're hanging out for a while when all of a sudden the friend says to him, "So when did you stop smoking?" And he says, "Oh, I didn't." And the friend says, "I've offered you a cigarette and you've turned it down twice." That's when Andersen thinks back and he remembers that he had a cigarette the morning before, but it tasted so bad, he put it away. So he has just stopped smoking just spontaneously after years of trying to give up smoking. He even views women differently. He used to kind of just view them as basically objects. But now he doesn't. And he's in his 50s, and he says that he's never been in love. And his wife was like, "What?" I'm just kidding. He's not married. And one day his friend says, "My daughter wants to be a writer, and you're a writer. Can you maybe talk to her about how to break into that?" And so he's like, "All right, whatever." And he goes to meet his daughter, this other man's daughter, who's in her early 20s, and he totally falls in love with her, and the two of them are in love because he is one dirty dog. But then he describes this date that he had with her, and it was the cheesiest date. It was so painfully cheesy. I couldn't handle it. I had to do galvanometer training just to get over the trauma that was incurred by just reading about this stupid date. That's an aside. But he does start up this movement. He's doing EEG training and galvanic response training. And he's also talking to people about what to eat. And he also teaches breath work. He calls the whole thing ecology, which I thought had a different meaning, but that's what it means in this book. During this whole time, he's been visited on a regular basis by that same man in the violet jacket. Usually the man comes in dreams and gives him a hint or a clue or something like that, but always in a dream, except one night he wakes up and the man in the violet jacket is standing at the end of his bed. He tells Andersen that his initials are USA for a reason. And Andersen's like, yeah, I know, my parents were patriotic. And the man in the violet jacket is no, it meant more than that. You chose your parents and you chose to be called USA for a reason. And Andersen thinks about it, and he's actually able to remember before he was even born choosing his parents because they were going to name him USA. And so that's when the man in the violet jacket says, okay, now it is time. And he wraps his gold cane on the floor, and immediately Andersen is out of body and he's looking down at himself. And the man in the violet jacket just leaves him there floating above his body. And as he leaves, he says, practice in black light. And so eventually Andersen is able to kind of get back into his body, and then he wakes up and it's the next morning. And he doesn't even know if any of that actually happened, but he does decide to go out and buy a black light, but he uses it to help him get out of body. And he says, reflecting on the fact that ultraviolet was at the space end of the spectrum, and according to yoga theory, marked the entry of cosmic consciousness into the pineal gland. I guess that's why blacklight might actually be helpful in helping him get out of his body. So he does start practicing the balance between alpha and theta, getting more and more into the theta range, and he has a blacklight there with him. And after a while, he's able to float out of his body, but at first he's a little scared to go anywhere else. But then he starts traveling more further and further away from his body. Okay, so here's where the whole book takes a different turn. But he starts talking about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And he said that the men were debating it. They were thinking about scrapping the whole thing when suddenly a man showed up in the room. And the man gave them a riveting speech about the importance of this document. And he finished this meaningful speech with, God has given America to be free. And then the man disappears, or he leaves the room. But after that, everybody was like, you're right, we're going to move forward with this. And they all sign the Declaration of Independence. But Andersen claims that no one knew where this man came from, and no one knew where he went after that. And so Andersen himself starts to kind of question the founding fathers, where they got their inspiration for founding America. And he points out that some of the symbols on the seal of the United States are kind of mystical in origin. They're a little bit occultish, actually. There's an eagle that very much resembles a phoenix rising from the ashes. And on the back of the seal is literally a pyramid with an eye on the top, which is a very mystical symbol, a very occult symbol. So he's wondering how that influence came to them. So he points out these ancient mystery schools, which claim to be guardians of ancient knowledge. He said this knowledge could only be shared with a select few because if it was given out to anybody, it could be abused. And he says, but the evidence of this knowledge, even though we don't all have access to it, the evidence of it is clear in things like the ancient pyramids. We have no idea how they were built. And so he actually talks about a couple of times, when he visited the pyramids. And I'm not sure this part of the book, whether or not he physically was at the pyramids or if he was just at the pyramids in his mind. But he goes there, and while he's at the pyramids, he has this entire spiritual experience, this huge spiritual awakening, where he literally experiences being one with God, and he remembers his past lives. And he also remembers that time and time again, during all of these past lives, he was given the choice to become one with God, to follow the spiritual path, basically, or to accept worldly riches, essentially. And every single time he chose the world, he chose the worldly riches. And so this time he's like, no, I'm not going to make that decision again. I'm going to choose being one with God. And so with this realization, he's back in his apartment, and he's now ready to see the man in the violet jacket again. He wants to know what the man in the violet jacket has to say next. And on cue, the man shows up. And this is when the man in the violet jacket tells Andersen that he was actually supposed to be a lot like him. Andersen was supposed to be like the man in the violet jacket. But things kind of went awry. And it started with when Andersen was 16, and the violet jacket man says that forces outside of Andersen colluded to basically cause that scaffolding to crash so that Andersen would hit his head and have his pineal damaged, so that it would be hard for him to connect with the man in the violet jacket. But the man in the violet jacket would end up basically inspiring him to hang himself that night on purpose, so that he could go out of his body once again and talk with the council. And the council gave him a list of instructions of what to do next in order to open his pineal back up. And it was the violet jacket man who cut the rope as well. But they had to do that to him at the time because he was so trapped basically by smoking, by alcohol, and all of these egoic concerns that there was just no way they could get to him otherwise. And so here's where the man in the violet jacket tells him that it is his mission to create these schools. And he wants to call it Atlantis University. These schools where he teaches this ecology, this whole school of thought that he's come up with. Alpha training, theta training, a specific diet. And the violet jacket man says that this is the best way to help allay the polarities and the chaos that is taking over America, the USA. And so it is in a way to save the USA that he came, and that's why his initials are USA. I think that's really cheesy, but he says it in the book, and so I feel like I have to point that out. That was his goal. That was sort of what he came to Earth to do. And this is when Violet Jacket says that there are these dark forces that exist, and they come from other planets. There's a whole planetary system called the Deneb, D-E-N-E-B. I've never heard of it before. The Deneb star system. And these beings, they look a lot like humans, so we can't tell the difference. But they're here to basically cause chaos. And he says that they are led by Lucifer and his chief assistant, Satan. And he says that Lucifer, obviously eons ago, issued a proclamation of personal liberty, and he rejected allegiance to the Universal Father. And when he did that, a bunch of people joined him, and one entity who was basically the Prince of Earth, Caligastia was his name, he also pledged allegiance to Lucifer. And so Caligastia and others like him, they live on Earth, and they're neither ascending nor descending. So they're sort of maintaining this delicate balance and remaining immortal on that plane of neither ascending nor descending. And they can't ascend. And if they descend, that means they die, and they have to start all over at the very beginning. So they would be basically the lowliest microbe and have to go through their evolution all over again. So meanwhile, there are good guys that are from other planets, other aliens, I guess. And he says that they spread psychedelic plants all over the world so that we could get a hold of those and basically be able to be contacted by them. That's not the first time I've heard that. I've heard that, I think Graham Hancock said something similar. Like he was told that whenever he was basically under the influence of a psychedelic plant, that the aliens or the whatever angels had put those psychedelic plants there for us to be able to communicate with them again. The Violet Jacket Man continues to explain all these mysteries of the universe, and I invite you to pick up the book. It was kind of boring. And then once he's done, he then takes Andersen to this door, and he ushers him through the door, and he shuts it behind him. And Andersen finds himself in this huge room that's full of very old-fashioned clothing. And he looks around, and he picks a costume, and then he puts it on. And then he finds this other door, and the door says, "Entrance to the Magic Theater. Now playing the Cardinal's Ball. Come in costume." And so he opens the door, and suddenly he is in this ballroom full of people who are all in costumes. And he's in a masquerade ball from, I don't know, the 17th century or something. And all these people are dressed up in all these really ornate costumes. And everybody's drinking and dancing and having a good time. There's a band playing. When all of a sudden, everything stops. And this man, who's dressed up like a cardinal, but it's just a costume, he announces the arrival of Her Majesty Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. And he says that everybody goes silent, and they're all kind of a little nervous and uncomfortable. And Antoinette clears a place, I think, where the band was. She basically makes everybody move so that she can have a place to sit. And she walks to her place, and she's very cold and austere and intimidating. And she sits down, and she looks around the room at all these people who were kind of looking back at her. And she says, "How dull you all look." That's when this man comes out from the crowd, and he's wearing this long maroon cape, and he walks up to her and he says, "I will undertake to entertain your majesty. I am Count Alessandro de Cagliostro, privy to the secret teachings of the centuries. Under my hand and eye, objects return to nothingness, and from nothingness, objects arise." And with that, he produces a bowl of strawberries just in his hand all of a sudden. And Marie Antoinette is really delighted. She starts eating the strawberries. And he then starts producing all of this fruit. I don't know why it had to be fruit, but just tons of fruit comes out of his hands. And after a while, she's like, "Please stop. I can't eat all of this fruit." And that's when he uses his cape to produce this little mouse. It's a mouse, a real mouse in the middle of the crowd. And then he's able to magic up a rooster. And then he magics up a weasel. And everybody's kind of freaked out by this. And the rooster goes and kills the mouse. And while the rooster's killing the mouse, the weasel sneaks up and kills the rooster. And the man says, "I demonstrate with symbols, your majesty. The proud cock destroys the frightened mouse and is himself destroyed by the lurking weasel. Yet no one suspects the weasel who works in darkness." And Marie Antoinette is a little bit put off by this. She feels like he's definitely giving her a message that she doesn't want to hear, and she doesn't like it. And so her eyes are kind of narrowed. And that's when he He just literally magics up a bouquet of flowers and gives that to her, and then all is well. She's totally over it. And he performs a bunch of other magic tricks. Like at one point, he basically suspends his cape in air and he sits on it. And at another point, he's playing sort of a fake piano in the air. He's playing, and you can hear music coming out as he's playing this fake piano. So a lot of really impressive tricks. And then he says, "These are but minor powers, Your Majesty. They token only my grasp of secrets denied most men. But given me also are those higher powers by which the future is revealed. Is Your Majesty interested in such a demonstration?" And as he's saying this, he's handing her this small mirror that he just made up. And at first, Marie Antoinette's like, "You can't predict the future. No one can predict the future." And he's like, "All right." And then she's like, "Whatever." And she takes the mirror from him. But as she's taking the mirror, he kind of holds it. And he says, "A word of warning. To all mortals, the future is changeable. It is within the power of each man to create his own. But whoever gazes upon this mirror and sees his future revealed can no longer escape it. He is bound to it forever, no matter his will or his actions. Does Your Majesty care to look?" And she just impatiently takes it. And she looks at the mirror. And as she's looking at the mirror, she's growing more and more horrified. And she stands up from her chair and she screams and she drops the mirror and the flowers. She's holding her neck and she just faints right there. And everybody in the crowd is kind of freaking out and running around because they don't know if they're going to get in trouble or have their heads taken off for what just happened. And in all this chaos, Andersen is just standing there, and suddenly Cagliostro is standing right before him. And he says to Andersen, "You have seen the beginning of cataclysmic events, and I am the cause of them. The people of France will not be long rising. They will burn the Bastille and overthrow the monarchy. Blood will flow among the aristocrats. Neither king nor queen will be spared. Soon we will rule France. Before long, the world. Once again, I invite you to join us. Simply sign this pledge, and power and riches are yours." And Andersen takes the pledge, and he's looking at it, and suddenly he's back in his living room. And he looks at the pledge, and it literally says the Satanic Creed. I didn't know there was one. And the whole thing is written out in the book, by the way. I'm not going to go through it because it's really long. Some of it I actually didn't think was that bad. I thought some of it I would agree to. But apparently when he reads it, it's really horrible. It is ambiguously written. And essentially it's saying, I'll give up my soul for worldly riches, which we all know is probably a bad idea. And that's when Andersen realized that the guy who was Cagliostro, this magician, was Caligastia, the angel who was basically supposed to be overseeing the earth, but decided to join Lucifer instead. Just as an aside, this isn't the first time I've heard of a character warning Marie Antoinette about what was about to happen. So I also heard a story once upon a time of Fulcanelli doing this, coming to her and telling her that her head is tenuously placed upon her shoulders. So he's sitting there in his living room reading the Satanic Creed, and that's when the man in the violet jacket returns. And he's kind of in physical form. He even knocks on the door. And he sits down and he basically says, he asks him, "So what do you think? Are you going to sign it or not?" And he decides against doing it. He gives it to the man in the violet jacket, who then burns it. And that's when the violet jacket man says something. He explains even more mysteries of the universe. This goes on for a very long time. If you want to know all the mysteries of the universe, pick up the book. It's not that expensive on Kindle. It was a little bit boring. But he explains a bunch of stuff. In and amongst the things that he talks about, he says that Lucifer is actually really sorry for what he did. because he can't ascend. He's basically stuck on this plane. If he descends, then he has to go back to square one. So he doesn't want to do that, but he doesn't really like where he is either. And he said this is the best example of the Faustian bargain. It's just being trapped here on Earth and never being allowed to return to God. And I thought that was really sad. And so then he tells Andersen what his goal is on life, what his purpose was for coming to Earth in the first place. And he said, your goal, your aim is to shed light on Earth. And he says there are 7 scrolls of, I guess, wisdom that were preserved from Atlantis. And these scrolls are about truth. They're about the fountain of youth, the garden of evil, I was reading the next one. The Garden of Eden, the cure for all evil, the elixir of life, the keys to the kingdom, and the source of all knowledge. And then he hands them the first one, the keys to the truth. That's what he gives him. And so he tells him that more will come in the future. And so I guess maybe that might be in his next book, because it wasn't there. And he tells him that his mission is to start Atlantis University, where he shares all of what he's found with his ecology philosophy with everyone. The alpha training, the resistance training, the diet, all that kind of breath work, that kind of thing. And interestingly, I looked up Atlantis University because I got really excited, like maybe he actually started this and it's still going on. But I just found a college in Florida, and I don't think it's that. I think it's just a college in Florida. It's just like a normal school. So Andersen would go on to write another book called The Secret Power of the Pyramids. And this book is $25 on Amazon. You can only get it used. And I was so desperate after reading this. I just thought, I have to get this book now. And so I bought it. So I will be covering the next book. Hopefully it's good. If it's not, then I'm going to be super pissed because that was really expensive. But that is it for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed reading it. And I will catch you next time.